Chapter 37 of Thrilling Narratives of Mutiny, Murder, and Piracy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Melvin Lee. Thrilling Narratives of Mutiny, Murder, and Piracy by Anonymous. Chapter 37, Early American Heroism. During one of the former wars between France and England, in which the then colonies bore an active part, a respectable individual, a member of the Society of Friends, of the name of Blank, commanded a fine ship which sailed from an eastern port to a port in England. This vessel had a strong and effective crew, but was totally unarmed. When near her destined port, she was chased and ultimately overhauled by a French vessel of war. Her commander used every endeavor to escape, but seeing from the superior sailing of the Frenchmen that his capture was inevitable, he quietly retired below and was followed into the cabin by his cabin boy, a youth of activity and enterprise named Charles Weir. He asked his commander if nothing more could be done to save the ship. His commander replied that it was impossible, that everything had been done that was practicable. There was no escape for them, and they must submit to be captured. Charles then returned upon deck and summoned the crew around him. He stated in a few words what was their captain's conclusion. Then, with an elevation of mind dedicated by a soul formed for enterprise and noble daring, he observed, "If you will place yourselves under my command and stand by me, I have conceived a plan by which the ship may be rescued, and we in turn become the conquerors." The sailors, no doubt feeling the ardor and inspired by the courage of their youthful and gallant leader, agreed to place themselves under his command. His plan was communicated to them, and they awaited with firmness the moment to carry their enterprise into effect. The suspense was of short duration, for the Frenchman was quickly alongside and grappled to the merchant ship. As Charles had anticipated, the exhilarated conquerors, elated beyond measure with the acquisition of so fine a prize, poured into his vessel, cheering and huzzaying, and not foreseeing any danger, they left but a few men aboard their ship. Now was the moment for Charles, who, giving his men the signal, sprang at their head on board the opposing vessel, while some seized the arms which had been left in profusion on her deck, and with which they soon overpowered the few men left on board. The others, by a simultaneous movement, relieved her from the grapplings which united the two vessels. Our hero, now having the command of the French vessel, seized the helm, and, placing her out of boarding distance, hailed with the voice of a conqueror the discomfited crowd of Frenchmen who were left on board of the peaceful bark he had just quitted, and summoned them to follow close in his wake, or he would blow them out of the water, a threat they well knew he was very capable of executing, as their guns were loaded during the chase. They sorrowfully acquiesced with his commands, while gallant Charles steered into port, followed by his prize. The exploit excited universal applause. The former master of the merchant vessel was examined by the Admiralty, when he stated the whole of the enterprise as it occurred, and declared that Charles Weir had planned and effected the gallant exploit, and that to him alone belonged the honor and credit of the achievement. Charles was immediately transferred to the British Navy, appointed a midshipman, and his education carefully superintended. He soon after distinguished himself in action, and underwent a rapid promotion, until at length he was created an admiral, and known as Sir Charles Weir. It is said that he always held in veneration and esteem the respectable and conscientious friend whose cabin boy he had been, and transmitted yearly to his old master, as he termed him, a handsome present of Madeira to cheer his declining days. End of chapter 37, Early American Heroism.
Chapter 38 of Thrilling Narratives of Mutiny, Murder, and Piracy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Thrilling Narratives of Mutiny, Murder, and Piracy by Anonymous. Chapter 38 Fingal's Cave. The most magnificent of all known caverns is that called Fingal's Cave, in the Isle of Staffa, on the western coast of Scotland. Its length is 370 feet, and the height at the entrance of the cave is 117 feet. Thousands of majestic columns of basalt support a lofty roof, under which the sea rolls its waves, while the vastness of the entrance allows the light of day to penetrate the various recesses of the cave. "The mind," says Mr. Pennant, "can hardly form an idea more magnificent than such a space, supported on each side by ranges of columns, and roofed by the bottom of those which have been broken off in order to form it, between the angles of which a yellow stalagmatic matter has exuded, which serves to define the angles precisely, and, at the same time, vary the colour with a great deal of elegance. To render it still more agreeable, the whole is lighted from without, so that the furthest extremity is very plainly seen, and the air within, being agitated by the flux and reflux of the tides, is perfectly wholesome, and free from the damp vapours with which caverns generally abound." End of chapter 38. Recording by Todd.
Chapter 39 of Thrilling Narratives of Mutiny, Murder, and Piracy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Thrilling Narratives of Mutiny, Murder, and Piracy by Anonymous. Chapter 39. The Loss of the Ramillies in the Atlantic Ocean. Admiral, afterwards Lord, Graves, having requested leave to return to England in 1782, was appointed by Lord Rodney to command the convoy sent home with the numerous fleet of merchantmen from the West Indies in the month of July. He accordingly hoisted his flag on board the Ramillies of 74 guns, and sailed on the 25th from Blue Fields, having under his orders the Canada and Centaur of 74 guns each, the Pallas frigate of 36 guns, and the following French ships, taken by Lord Rodney and Sir Samuel Hood, out of the armament commanded by the Count de Grasse, viz., the Ville de Paris of 110 guns, the Glorieux and Hector of 74 guns each, the Ardent, Caton, and Jason of 6 guns each. Those which were originally British ships had been in so many actions, and so long absent from England, as to have become extremely out of condition, while that of the prizes was still more deplorable; and the following authentic account of the various disasters which attended this distressed convoy will be found equally melancholy and interesting. Soon after the fleet had sailed, the officers of the Ardent united in signing such a representation of her miserable plight as induced Admiral Graves to order her back to Port Royal, and the Jason, by not putting to sea with the convoy, from want of water, never joined them at all. The rest proceeded, and after those vessels that were bound for New York had separated, the whole convoy was reduced to 92 or 3 sail. On the 8th of September the Caton, springing a leak, made such alarming complaints that the Admiral directed her and the Pallas, also become leaky, to bear away immediately and keep company together, making for Halifax, which then bore north-north-west, and was but 87 leagues distant. The afternoon of the 16th of September, showing indications of a gale and foul weather from the south-east quarter, every preparation was made on board the flag-ship for such an event, not only on account of her own safety, but also as an example to the rest of the fleet. The Admiral collected the ships about 6 o'clock, and brought to under his mainsail on the larboard tack, having all his other sails furled, and his top-gallant yards and masts lowered down. The wind soon increasing, blew strong from the east-south-east, with a very heavy sea, and about 3 o'clock in the morning of the 17th flew suddenly round to the contrary point, blowing most tremendously, and accompanied with rain, thunder, and lightning. The Ramillies was taken by the lee, her mainsail thrown back, her main-mast went by the board, and mizzen-mast half-way up. The fore-topmast fell over the starboard bow, the fore-yard broke in the slings, the tiller snapped in two, and the rudder was nearly torn off. Thus was this capital ship, from being in perfect order, reduced within a few minutes to a mere wreck, by the fury of the blast and the violence of the sea, which acted in opposition to each other. The ship was pooped, the cabin, where the admiral lay, was flooded, his cot-bed jerked down by the violence of the shock and the ship's instantaneous revulsion, so that he was obliged to pull on his boots half-leg deep in water, without any stockings, to huddle on his wet clothes, and repair upon deck. On his first coming thither, he ordered 2 of the lieutenants to examine into the state of the affairs below, and to keep a sufficient number of people at the pumps, while he himself and the captain kept the deck, to encourage the men to clear away the wreck, which, by its constant swinging backwards and forwards by every wave against the body of the ship, had beaten off much of the copper from the starboard side, and exposed the seams so much to the sea that the decayed oakum washed out, and the whole frame became at once exceedingly porous and leaky. At dawn of day they perceived a large ship lying under their lee, lying upon her side, waterlogged, her hands attempting to wear her by first cutting away the mizzen-mast and then her mainmast, hoisting her ensign with the union downwards in order to draw the attention of the fleet, but to no purpose, for no succour could be given, and she very soon went down head foremost, the fly of her ensign being the last thing visible. This was the Dutton, formerly an East Indiaman, and then a store-ship, commanded by a lieutenant of the navy, who in his agitation leaped from her deck into the sea, but, as might be expected, was very soon overwhelmed by its billows. 12 or 13 of the crew contrived, however, to slide off one of the boats, and running with the wind, first endeavoured to reach a large ship before them, which, not being able to fetch, and afraid of filling it, they attempted to haul up for the purpose. They made up for another ship more to the leeward, who fortunately descrying them, threw a number of ropes, by the help of which these desperate fellows scrambled up her sides, and fortunately saved their lives. Out of 94 or 5 sail seen the day before, scarcely 20 could now be counted. Of the ships of war, there were discerned the Canada, half hull down upon the lee quarter, having her main topmast and mizzen-mast gone, the main top damaged, the main yard aloft, and the mainsail furled. The Centaur was far to windward, without masts, bowsprit, or rudder, and the Glorieux without foremast, bowsprit, or main topmast. Of these the 2 latter perished with all their crews, excepting the captain of the Centaur, and a few of his people, who contrived to slip off her stern with one of the boats unnoticed, and thus escaped the fate of the rest of the crew. The Ville de Paris appeared to have received no injury, and was commanded by a most experienced seaman, who had made 24 voyages to and from the West Indies, and had therefore been pitched upon to lead the ship through the Gulf. Nevertheless, she was afterwards buried in the ocean with all on board her, consisting of above 800 people. Of the convoy, beside the Dutton before mentioned, and the British Queen, several others were discovered without mast or bowsprit, 18 lost masts, and several others had foundered. In the course of this day the Canada crossed upon and passed the Ramillies. Some of the trade attempted to follow the Canada, but she ran at such a rate that they soon found it to be in vain, and then returned towards the flagship. The Ramillies had at this time 6 feet water in her hold, and the pumps would not free her, the water having worked out the oakum, and her beams amidship being almost drawn from their clamps. The admiral, therefore, gave orders for all the buckets to be manned, and every officer to help towards freeing the ship. The mizzen topsail was set upon the foremast, the main top gallant sail on the stump of the mizzen-mast, and the tiller shipped. In this condition, by bearing away, she scudded on at so good a rate that she held pace with some of the merchantmen. The day having been spent in bailing and pumping, without materially gaining on the water, the captain, in the name of the officers, represented to the admiral the necessity of parting with the guns for the relief of the ship, but he objected that there would then be left no protection for the convoy. At length, however, after great difficulty, he consented to their disposing of the foresail and aftermost quarter-deck guns, together with some of the shot, and other articles of very great weight. The ensuing night was employed in bailing and endeavouring to make the pumps useful, for the ballast by getting into the well had choked and rendered them useless, and the chains had broken every time they were repaired. The water had risen to 7 feet in the hold. The wind from the westward drove a vast sea before it, and the ship being old, strained most violently. On the morning of the 18th nothing could be seen of the Canada, she having pushed on at her greatest speed for England. The frame of the Ramillies having opened during the night, the admiral was prevailed on, by the renewed and pressing remonstrances of the officers, although with great reluctance, to let 6 of the forwardmost and 4 of the aftermost guns of the main deck to be thrown overboard, together with the remainder of those on the quarter-deck, and the ship still continuing to open very much, he ordered tarred canvas and hides to be nailed fore and aft from under the sills of the ports on the main deck, after the 5th plank above, or within the waterways, and the crew, without orders, did the same on the lower deck. Her increasing complaints requiring still more to be done, the admiral directed all the guns on the upper deck, the shot, both on that and the lower deck, and various heavy stores to be thrown overboard. A leakage in the light room of the grand magazine having almost filled the ship forward, and there being 8 feet water in the magazine, every gentleman was compelled to take his turn at the whips, or in handing the buckets. The ship was besides frapped from the foremast to the mainmast. Notwithstanding their utmost efforts, the water still gained on them the succeeding night, the wind blowing very hard, with extremely heavy squalls. A part of the orlop deck fell into the hold. The ship herself seemed to work excessively and to settle forward. On the morning of the 19th, under these very alarming circumstances, the admiral commanded both the bower anchors to be cut away, all the junk to be flung overboard, 1 sheet and 1 bower cable to be reduced to junk and served the same way, together with every remaining ponderous store that could be got at, and all the powder in the grand magazine, it being damaged, the cutter and pinnace to be broken up and tossed overboard, the skids having already worked off the side. Every soul on board was now employed in bailing. One of the pumps was got up, but to no purpose, for the shot lockers being broken down, some of the shot, as well as the ballast, had fallen into the well, and as the weather moderated a little, everything was made ready to heave the lower deck guns into the sea, the admiral being anxious to leave nothing undone for the relief of the ship. When evening approached, there being 20 merchant ships in sight, the officers united in beseeching him to go into one of them, but this he positively refused to do, deeming it, as he declared, unpardonable in a commander-in-chief to desert his garrison in distress; that his living a few years longer was of very little consequence, but that by leaving his ship at such a time he should discourage and slacken the exertions of the people by setting a very bad example. The wind lulling somewhat during the night, all hands bailed the water, which, at this time, was 6 feet fore and aft. On the morning of the 20th the admiral ordered the spare and stream anchors to be cut away, and within the course of the day all the lower deck guns to be thrown overboard. When evening came, the spirits of the people in general, and even of the most courageous, began to fail, and they openly expressed the utmost despair, together with the most earnest desire of quitting the ship, lest they should founder in her. The admiral hereupon advanced and told them that he and their officers had an equal regard for their own lives, and that the officers had no intention of deserting either them or the ship; that, for his part, he was determined to try one night more in her. He therefore hoped and entreated they would do so too, for there was still room to imagine that one fair day, with a moderate sea, might enable them, by united exertions, to clear and secure the well against the encroaching ballast which washed into it; that if this could be done, they might be able to restore the chains to the pumps and use them, and that then hands enough might be spared to raise jury masts, with which they might carry the ship to Ireland; that her appearance alone, while she could swim, would be sufficient to protect the remaining part of her convoy; above all, that as everything that could be thought of had now been done for her relief, it would be but reasonable to wait the effect. He concluded with assuring them that he would make the signal directly for the trade to lie by them during the night, which he doubted not they would comply with. This temperate speech had the desired effect. The firmness and confidence with which he spoke, and their reliance on his seamanship and judgment, as well as his constant presence and attention to every accident, had a wonderful effect upon them. They became pacified, and returned to their duty and their labours. Since the first disaster the admiral had, in fact, scarcely ever quitted the deck. This they had all observed, together with his diligence in personally inspecting every circumstance of distress. Knowing his skill and experience, they placed great confidence in them, and he instantly made, according to his promise, a signal for all the merchantmen. At this period, it must be confessed, there was great reason for alarm, and but little for hope, for all the anchors and guns, excepting one, together with every other matter of weight, had been thrown overboard, and yet the ship did not seem at all relieved. The strength of the people was, likewise, so nearly exhausted, having had no sleep since the first fatal stroke, that one half of the crew were ordered to bail and the other to repose, so that, although the wind was much abated, the water still gained upon them, in spite of all their efforts, and the ship rolled and worked most prodigiously in a most unquiet sea. At 3 in the morning of the 21st, being the 4th night, the well being quite broken in, the casks, ballast, and remaining shot rushed together and destroyed the cylinders of the pumps. The frame and carcass of the ship began to give way in every part, and the whole crew exclaimed that it was impossible to keep her any longer above water. In this extremity the admiral resolved within himself not to lose a moment in removing the people whenever daylight should arrive, but told the captain not to communicate any more of his design than that he intended to remove the sick and lame at daybreak, and for this purpose he should call on board all the boats of the merchantmen. He nevertheless gave private orders to the captain, while this was doing, to have all the bread brought upon the quarter deck, with a quantity of beef, pork, and flour, to settle the best distribution of the people according to the number of the trade ships that could obey their signal, and to allow an officer to each division of them to have the remaining boats launched, and as soon as the sick were disposed of, to begin to remove the whole of the crew, with the utmost dispatch, but without risking too many in a boat. Accordingly, at dawn the signal was made for the boats of the merchantmen, but nobody suspected what was to follow, until the bread was entirely removed and the sick gone. About 6 o'clock the rest of the crew were permitted to go off, and between 9 and 10, there being nothing further to direct and regulate, the admiral himself, after shaking hands with every officer, and leaving his barge for their better accommodation and transport, quitted for ever the Ramillies, which then had 9 feet water in her hold. He went into a small leaky boat, loaded with bread, out of which both him and the surgeon who accompanied him were obliged to bail the water all the way. He was in his boots, with his surtout over his uniform, and his countenance as calm and as composed as ever. He had, at going off, desired a cloak, a cask of flour, and a cask of water, but could get only the flour, and he left behind all his stock, wines, furniture, books, and charts, which had cost him upwards of £1,000, being unwilling to employ even a single servant in saving or packing up what belonged to himself alone, in a time of such general calamity, as to appear better in that respect than any of the crew. The admiral rode for the Belle, Captain Forster being the first of the trade that had borne up to the Ramillies the preceding night in her imminent distress, and by his anxious humanity set such an example to his brother traders as had a powerful influence upon them, an influence which was generally followed by 16 others. By 3 o'clock most of the crew were taken out, at which time the Ramillies had 13 feet water in her hold, and was evidently foundering in every part. At 4:30 the captain and first and third lieutenants left her, with every soul excepting the fourth lieutenant, who stayed behind only to execute the admiral's orders for setting fire to her wreck when finally deserted. The carcass burned rapidly, and the flames quickly reaching the powder, which was filled in the after magazine, and had been lodged very high, in 35 minutes the decks and upper works blew up with a horrid explosion and cloud of smoke, while the lower part of the hull was precipitated to the bottom of the ocean. At this time the admiral, in the Belle, stood for the wreck to see his last orders executed, as well as to succour any boats that might be too full of men, the swell of the sea being prodigious, although the weather had been moderate ever since noon on the foregoing day. There were, however, at intervals, some squalls, with threats of the weather soon becoming violent. It was not long before they were realized, for within 2 hours after the last of the crew were put on board their respective ships, the wind rose to a great height, and so continued, with intermission, for 6 or 7 successive days, so that no boat could, during that time, have lived in the water. On such a small interval depended the salvation of more than 600 lives. Indeed, during the 4 days immediately preceding this catastrophe, it blew such a strong gale, and such a heavy sea followed the Ramillies, that it was always necessary to keep her with the wind upon her quarter, with seldom more than the spritsail hoisted upon her foremast, and at times with no sail at all, in which state she would run at the rate of 6 miles an hour. Whenever the main top gallant sail was set on the stump of the mizzenmast, she commonly griped too much, so as to render the steerage very difficult; and yet this had been carried, whenever it could be, in order to keep pace with the merchantmen, the slowest of which went nearly as fast under their bare poles. Even in running thus, the Ramillies rolled prodigiously, and as she grew lighter every day, her motion became more uneasy, so that the men could scarcely stand to their work, or keep their legs without something to lay hold by. There was no such thing as real repose for them while sitting or lying down upon deck, nor steadiness enough to eat or drink with any security. No meat could be dressed, nor did any man or officer go into bed. Until the afternoon of the 20th there was no venturing to bring her to, even for a boat to come on board. But notwithstanding this desperate condition, when some were hourly dropping through fatigue and want of sleep, and the decks were covered with water, the whole of the crew behaved with the utmost obedience, attention, and sobriety, and remitted no possible exertion for the preservation of the ship. Upon the separation taking place, the officers, who were distributed with portions of the crew among the Jamaica men, had orders respectively to deliver them to the first man of war or tender they should meet with, and to acquaint the Secretary of the Admiralty by the earliest opportunity of their proceedings. A pendant was hoisted on board the Belle, by way of distinction, that she might, if possible, lead the rest. Some of the trade kept with her, and others made the best of their way, apprehensive lest they should soon fall short of provisions, as they had so many more to feed. The Silver Eel transport, which had sailed from Bluefields with the invalids of Sir George Rodney's fleet, and was under the command of a lieutenant of the navy, had been ordered to keep near the Ramillies. The ship was accordingly at hand on the 21st of September, the day of her destruction, and in consequence of several deaths on the passage, had room enough for the reception of all who were now ailing or maimed, and was therefore charged with them, being properly fitted for their accommodation. The Silver Eel parted from the Admiral in latitude 42·48 north, and longitude 45·19 west, after seeing the Ramillies demolished, and being ordered to make for the first port, ran into Falmouth on the 6th of October, on the forenoon of which day one of the trade ships, with a midshipman and 16 of the crew of the Ramillies, reached Plymouth Sound. Another of the same convoy, having on board another part of the crew, with the captain and first lieutenant, anchored in the same place before daylight the next morning. The Canada, however, having exerted her utmost speed, had, prior to all these, on the 4th of the same month, got into Portsmouth, where she spread the news of the dispersion of this miserable fleet, which being conveyed to France, her privateers immediately put to sea, in hopes of making prizes of them. Some of the Jamaica men, with part of the crew of the Ramillies, fell into their hands. 2 of the West Indiamen were captured in sight of the Belle, but she herself with the admiral and 33 of his crew arrived safe, though singly, on the 10th of October in Cork Harbour, where was the Myrmidon frigate. The admiral immediately hoisted his flag on board the latter, and sailing with the first fair wind, arrived on the 17th in Plymouth Sound, apparently in good health, but with a settled oppression upon his breast, from having been so long and so dreadfully exposed upon the deck of the Ramillies in the horrid night when she was first overtaken by the storm. Nor could he remove that complaint for upward of 6 months. He brought away with him nothing but a few of his private papers, the rest of his effects having shared the same fate as his ship. It was calculated that by the destruction of the fleet upwards of 21,500 persons perished. The loss of property has been estimated by the British Government to be upwards of £20,000,000. This gale, which continued for 6 days, was the most tremendous one on record. End of chapter 39.
Chapter 40 of Thrilling Narratives of Mutiny, Murder, and Piracy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. Thrilling Narratives of Mutiny, Murder, and Piracy by Anonymous. Chapter 40. Preservation of 9 men in a small boat surrounded by islands of ice. We sailed from Plymouth under convoy of H.B. Majesty's ship St. Albans and 2 other ships of war, together with a fleet of merchantmen bound to the Mediterranean, having a fresh gale at northeast. The wind still continuing, we kept company with the fleet until reaching 120 leagues to the westward. Then, judging ourselves clear of privateers, we proceeded on our voyage. But before gaining 300 leagues, on the 17th of March, we came up with an English-built ship of about 200 tons, carrying 12 guns, and sailing under a jury mainmast. On our approach, she hoisted English colors, and on being hailed, told us she belonged to London, and was now bound from Virginia homewards, which seemed probable, as many tame fowl were on board, and a red bird flew from her to us. Our captain, seeing the vessel disabled, desired her to bring to, saying if anything was wanted on board, we should hoist out our boat and carry it thither. But this was obstinately refused. The captain declared that our boat should not approach, and unless we kept further off, he would fire into us. This induced suspicion on our part, wherefore we run up with the vessel and commanded her to bring to. On this she fired, and engaged us from 11 in the morning until 6 in the evening. Then, being much damaged, she struck and called to us to save the lives of the crew. But this request came too late, for the wind increasing raised a great sea, which forced our ship under a reefed mainsail, whence we could not hoist out our boat without endangering our own lives. However, by means of a light which she carried, we kept close to her, intending to hoist the boat out when it became practicable. But towards midnight her light became very low, and by a loud cry, which was heard about 1 o'clock, we judged that she foundered. When the vessel struck, she told us that she had 14 Frenchmen on board, whence we conjectured her to be an English Virginia man taken by the French, and that she had lost her mainmast in the engagement. We followed her, chasing and fighting about 30 leagues, and when she struck we were in 4550 north latitude. Our booty being thus lost, we made the best of our way to Newfoundland, being bound thither on a fishing voyage. One trouble, however, seldom comes alone, and so it happened to us. For on the 26th of March we saw some shattered ice at 4 in the afternoon, which was supposed to be the harbor ice now broken up. We were now in 4650 north latitude, and conceived ourselves 50 leagues, though it afterwards proved 70 from the land. The wind being at east, the topsails were handed, and we stood northward under our courses, hoping to get clear of the ice before night. But finding rather more than less, we tacked to the southward, which was found unproductive of any change. Therefore, for further security, the foresail was furled, and the ship brought to under the mainsail as night approached. And as there was a dead wind, so that we could lie off on neither tack, we trusted, if we should fall in with the greater ice, to meet with the less shocks. About 8 or 9 o'clock we discovered a field of ice, of which we ran foul, notwithstanding our exertions to keep clear of it. And although we hung cables, coils of rope, hoops, and such things over the ship to defend her, she struck so hard that at 11 she bilged, whence we had much difficulty to keep her afloat till daylight, by 2 pumps going and bailing at 3 hatchways. At the approach of day our men were much fatigued, the water increased, and against noon the hold was half full. No one knew what to advise another, and all began to despair of our lives. We continued pumping, though to little purpose, and concluded that if now were our appointed time, we must submit patiently to it. But amidst this disaster it pleased God to put it into the thoughts of some of us that several might be preserved in the boat, whence the captain was entreated to hoist her out and commit a few of us there. The captain answered that although God could work wonders, it was improbable that so small a boat should preserve us, that it was but living a few days longer in misery, and seeing God had cast this calamity to his lot, he was resolved to take his chance and die with his men. Nevertheless, being much importuned, he ordered the boat out, and William Saunders and 5 others in her, and that the men might not suspect their design, it was given out that the boat should go ahead to tow the ship clear of the ice. How likely that was the reader may judge, there being but 1 oar. All the rest were broken by defending the ship from the ice. However, the purpose advanced. The boat being out, and finding no effect produced in towing the ship, fell astern, intending to take in the captain and as many as it could safely carry, while some were preparing necessaries for a miserable voyage. A compass and other things ready were conveyed into it. The captain, doctor, and several others, having got out at the cabin windows and galleries, I, amongst the rest, endeavored to escape at the gallery, intending likewise, if possible, to get into the boat, but being discovered by the men, they took small arms and kept us off the boat, resolving, as she could not preserve all, that the whole should perish together. This design being frustrated, every one except myself and William Langmead got into the ship again, but we were so low that we could not recover ourselves. No person coming to relieve us, we were at length forced to let go our hold and trust to the mercy of those in the boat, who, seeing us swimming towards them, hove out a rope and took us in. We were now 8 in number in the boat, and willing to save our captain, lay hovering about the ship till night. but the men, persisting in their resolution, fired at the boat and kept her off. We began to seek shelter as night approached, and having gone among the shattered ice, made our boat fast to a small lump, and drove with it, and as we came foul of great ice, we removed and made fast to another piece, and so continued during the remainder of the night. Looking around in the morning, the ship was seen about 3 leagues to the eastward, in the same position as we had left her, whereon a consultation was held whether or not we should return and make another attempt to save the captain, and as many more as possible. This proposal, however, was negatived, every one alleging that the men would either fire on us or inconsiderately crowd into the boat and sink her. Therefore it was resolved to make the best of our way to the shore. But I, considering how little it would tend to my honour to save my life and see my captain perish, endeavoured to persuade them that the ship still swam buoyant, that I hoped the leak was stopped, and that we might proceed on our voyage. But this was unavailing. When I saw myself unable to prevail thus, I desired them to row up and set me on that part of the ice next the ship, whence I should walk to her and die with my commander. This being unanimously agreed to, we rowed to the ice, but when we reached it, I was loath to go out. However, on calling the captain to us, Mr. John Medic came first, and after him the doctor and some others, which the captain perceiving came also. The captain having left the ship, the multitude crowded so eagerly after him that we had like to have spoiled all. But by chance the boat was got off with 21 people in her and hanging to her sides. Some were forced to slip, others perished on the ice, not being able to return to the ship, where the rest were lost. On the 25th of March we took a miserable farewell of our distressed brethren, the heart of every one being so overloaded with his own misery as to have little room to pity another. Next, on considering what course to follow, we resolved to make for the shore. Our only provision was a small barrel of flour and a 5-gallon rundlet of brandy, which had been thrown overboard and was taken up by us. We also took up an old chest, which stood us in good stead, for having but one oar, and our ship's handspikes and a hatchet being by chance in the boat, we could split the chest and nail it to the handspikes, which were our oars. Nails we had only by drawing them from different parts of the boat, and the rest of the chest was used to kindle a fire. It also happened that our main tarpaulin, which had been newly tarred, was put into the boat. Of it we made a mainsail, and of an old piece of canvas that had been a sail to a yawl we made a foresail. In this condition we turned towards the shore, and observing the surrounding ice lie north and south, we steered north, and in the morning were clear of it. Having now got into the ocean, and the wind still being easterly, we hoisted our sail, and steered west-northwest, about 14 leagues, when we fell in with another field of ice. Attempting to sail through it, we were enclosed by many great islands, which drove so fast together that we were forced to haul up our boat on the ice. Otherwise, we should have perished. Here we lay 11 days without once seeing the sea. As the ice was thick, we caught as many seals as we chose. They were in great abundance. Our fire hearth was made of the skin, and the fat melted so easily that we could boil the lean with it. But by lying so long in this cold region, the men began to complain of their feet, and our boat being too small to afford room for all, there was always a hideous cry among us of hurting each other, though for this there was no remedy. We kept watch, 6 and 6, both for the convenience of room and to guard against the ice breaking under the boat, which often happened, and then it was necessary to launch or carry her to a place which we thought strong enough to bear her weight. In 11 days we saw the sea, and with great difficulty got out the boat. We sailed about 10 or 12 leagues north-northwest as before, when we were again enclosed, and this was repeated 5 several times. The last ice, however, was worse than any before, and although it was so thick that we could not force the boat through it, yet it was not so solid as to bear the weight of a man. Therefore, notwithstanding, we daily saw enough of seals, we could take none of them. It fortunately happened that when we parted from the hard ice, we had 7 seals in store, and one that we took dead, which was consumed without consulting how it had died. We were next reduced to short allowance, having only one among us to serve 2 days, which with about 3 ounces of flour mixed with water and boiled in the fat of the seal was all our provision. At length we were obliged to share both feet and skin, each of us allowing a little fat to make a fire, but being constrained to eat the whole, skin and bone also, scarcely boiled, injured our stomachs so much that some of our number died, and I myself suffered severely. On getting clear of the loose ice, if the wind was so adverse as to prevent our rowing, we made fast the boat to an island of ice until better weather. Although this sheltered us, we were often in great danger from the islands driving foul of us, so that it was wonderful we escaped. We drank the ice mixed with brandy, and our provisions, with good management, lasted until our coming ashore, for it pleased God to save some of us by taking others to himself. Our companions began to die 2 or 3 in a day, until we were at last reduced to 9. The feet of several who died were bit in such a manner by the frost, that on stripping them, which was done to give the clothes to the survivors, their toes came away with the stockings. The last who died was the boatswain, who lived until the day before we saw land. Our compass was broke by the last field of ice through which we passed, and soon after we lost our water bucket, which was used for bailing. Our course was directed by the sun in the daytime, and the stars by night. Though many other accidents befell us, it pleased the Lord to bring us safe to land, after passing 28 days in the boat. On the 24th of April we arrived at Baccalieu, and thence repaired to the Bay of Verds in Newfoundland, where we found 3 men providing for a fishing voyage, who carried us to their house and gave us such things as they had. But they being indifferently stored, and unable to maintain us, we determined to go to St. John's, notwithstanding some of us were so much frostbit as to be obliged to be carried to the boat. Before getting to Cape St. Francis, however, the wind veered to the southwest, which compelled us to row all night. In the morning we reached Portugal Cove, where, to our unspeakable joy, some men were found preparing for the summer's fishing. They showed us so much compassion as to launch a boat and tow us over to Belle-Isle, and there we were courteously received. All were so weak that we were carried ashore on men's shoulders, and we were besides so disfigured with hunger, cold, and the oil of seals, that people could hardly recognize us as men, except for the shape. At Belle-Isle we remained 10 days, when, being somewhat recruited, we went to St. John's. Thus, in all this extremity, God miraculously preserved 9 out of 96 that were in the ship. End of chapter 40. Recording by John Brandon. Chapter 41 of the thrilling narratives of mutiny, murder, and piracy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. Thrilling Narratives of Mutiny, Murder, and Piracy by Anonymous. Chapter 41. Captain Ross's Expedition. In the year 1818, the British government fitted out 2 expeditions to the North Pole. Captain Buchan, commanding the Trent and the Dorothy, was directed to attempt a passage between Spitzbergen and Nova Zembla over the Pole into the Pacific, and Captain Ross, commanding the Isabella and the Alexander, to attempt the northwest passage from Davis's Straits to Baffin's Bay into the frozen ocean, and thence into the Pacific. Ross reached 77 degrees 40 minutes latitude, and more accurately determined the situation of Baffin's Bay, which until then was believed to extend 10 degrees further to the east than it actually does. Although he sailed up Lancaster Sound, he did not advance far enough to ascertain if it was open, not having arrived there until October 1st, when danger from the ice obliged him to quit the coast. Lieutenant Parry, who had accompanied Captain Ross, was sent, in conjunction with Captain Leon, in the year 1819, on a second voyage into Baffin's Bay, and having penetrated as far as to gain the first prize offered by Parliament, £5,000, and having made the most western point ever reached in the polar seas, he was entrusted with the direction of the Hecla and Fury on a similar expedition in 1821. These ships returned in October 1823 without achieving the principal object for which they were dispatched. In 1824, Parry and Leon were again sent out for the discovery of a northwest passage in the Hecla and Fury. After wintering in Prince Regent's Bay, the ships sailed southwardly, and in consequence of storms and icebergs, it became necessary to abandon the Fury, and with her crew on board the Hecla, Captain Parry returned to England in October 1825. The Admiralty sent Parry in the Hecla in 1827 to reach, if possible, the North Pole. Having journeyed 35 days over the ice, beginning at 81 degrees 12 minutes 15 seconds, he was compelled to retrace his course. So far, the exertions of the British government. Piqued by the real or supposed neglect of government, Captain Ross, in the spring of 1829, undertook an expedition on his own resources, with the view of effecting a passage into the Polar Sea, and to reach Behring's Straits along the northern coast of the American continent. The ship, the Victory, was lost in the first year out, and Ross and his crew had worn through the remaining time on board the wreck of the Fury. When picked up in Lancaster Sound, they were in 4 of the Fury's boats, which they had found uninjured and in the same condition in which they had been left. The following letter, addressed by the gallant navigator to the Admiralty, puts us in possession of all the adventures and discoveries of this memorable expedition. On board the Isabella of Hull, Baffin's Bay, September 1833. Sir, knowing how deeply my Lords Commissioners of the Admiralty are interested in the advancement of nautical knowledge, and particularly in the improvement of geography, I have to acquaint you for the information of your Lordships that the expedition, the main object of which is to solve, if possible, the question of a northwest passage from the Pacific to the Atlantic Ocean, particularly by Prince Regent's Inlet, and which sailed from England in May 1829, notwithstanding the loss of the foremast and other untoward circumstances, which obliged the vessel to refit in Greenland, reached the beach on which His Majesty's late ship Fury's stores were landed on the 13th of August. We found the boats, provisions, etc., in excellent condition, but no vestige of the wreck. After completing in fuel and other necessaries, we sailed on the 14th, and on the following morning rounded Cape Garry, where our new discoveries commenced, and keeping the western shore close on board, ran down the coast in a southwest and west course, in from 10 to 20 fathoms, until we had passed the latitude of 72 north in longitude 94 west. Here we found a considerable inlet leading to the westward, the examination of which occupied 2 days. At this place we were first seriously obstructed by ice, which was now seen to extend from the south cape of the inlet in a solid mass, round by east to east-northeast. Owing to this circumstance, the shallowness of the water, the rapidity of the tides, the tempestuous weather, the irregularity of the coast, and the numerous inlets and rocks for which it is remarkable, our progress was no less dangerous than tedious. Yet we succeeded in penetrating below the latitude of 70 north, in longitude 92 west, where the land, after having carried us as far east as 90, took a decidedly westerly direction, while land at the distance of 40 miles to southward was seen extending east and west. At this extreme point our progress was arrested on the 1st of October by an impenetrable barrier of ice. We, however, found an excellent wintering port, which we named Felix Harbor. Early in January 1830, we had the good fortune to establish a friendly intercourse with a most interesting consociation of natives, who, being insulated by nature, had never before communicated with strangers. From them we gradually obtained the important information that we had already seen the continent of America, that about 40 miles to the southwest there were two great seas, one to the west, which was divided from that to the east by a narrow strait or neck of land. The verification of this intelligence either way, on which our future operations so materially depended, devolved on Commander Ross, who volunteered this service early in April, and accompanied by one of the mates and guided by two of the natives, proceeded to the spot and found that the Northland was connected to the south by two ridges of high land, 15 miles in breadth, but taking into account a claim of freshwater lakes which occupied the valleys between. The dry land which actually separates the two oceans is only 5 miles. This extraordinary isthmus was subsequently visited by myself, when Commander Ross proceeded minutely to survey the sea-coast to the southward of the isthmus leading to the westward, which he succeeded in tracing to the 99th degree, or to 150 miles of Cape Turnagain of Franklin, to which point the land, after leading him into the 70th degree of north latitude, ended directly. During the same journey he also surveyed 30 miles of the adjacent coast, or that to the north of the isthmus, which, by also taking a westerly direction, forming the termination of the western sea into a gulf. The rest of this season was employed in tracing the sea coast south of the isthmus leading to the eastward, which was done so as to leave no doubt that it joined, as the natives had previously informed us, to Oakley and the land forming Repulse Bay. It was also determined that there was no passage to the westward for 30 miles to the northward of our position. This summer, like that of 1818, was beautifully fine, but extremely unfavorable for navigation, and our object being now to try a more northern latitude, we waited with anxiety for the disruption of the ice, but in vain, and our utmost endeavors did not succeed in retracing our steps more than 4 miles, and it was not until the middle of November that we succeeded in cutting the vessel into a place of security, which we named Sheriff's Harbor. I may here mention that we named the newly discovered continent to the southward Boothia, as also the isthmus, the peninsula to the north, and the eastern sea, after my worthy friend Felix Booth, Esquire, the truly patriotic citizen of London, who in the most disinterested manner enabled me to equip this expedition in superior style. The last winter was in temperature nearly equal to the mean of which had been experienced on the 4 preceding voyages, but the winters of 1830 and 1831 set in with a degree of violence hitherto beyond record. The thermometer sunk to 92 degrees below the freezing point, and the average of the year was 10 degrees below the preceding. But notwithstanding the severity of the summer, we traveled across the country to the West Sea by a chain of lakes, 30 miles north of the isthmus, when Commander Ross succeeded in surveying 50 miles more of the coast leading to the northwest, and by tracing the shore to the northward of our position, it was also fully proved that there could be no passage below the 71st degree. This autumn we succeeded in getting the vessel only 14 miles to the northward, as we had not doubled the eastern cape. All hope of saving the ship was at an end, and put quite beyond possibility by another very severe winter, and having only provisions to last us to the 1st of June, 1833. Dispositions were accordingly made to leave the ship in present port, which after her was named Victory Harbor. Provisions and fuel being carried forward in the spring, we left the ship on the 28th of May, 1832, for Fury Beach, being the only chance left for saving our lives. Owing to the very rugged nature of the ice, we were obliged to keep either upon or close to the land, making the circuit of every bay, thus increasing our distance of 200 miles by nearly one half. And it was not until the 1st of July that we reached the beach, completely exhausted by hunger and fatigue. A hut was speedily constructed, and the boats, 3 of which had been washed off the beach, but providentially driven on shore again, were repaired during this month, and the unusual heavy appearance of the ice afforded us no cheering prospect until the 1st of August, when in 3 boats we reached the ill-fated spot where the Fury was first driven on shore, and it was not until the 1st of September we reached Leopold South Island, now established to be the northeast point of America in latitude 73°56 and longitude 90 west. From the summit of the lofty mountain on the promontory we could see Prince Regent's Inlet, Barrow Strait, and Lancaster Sound, which presented one impenetrable mass of ice, just as I had seen it in 1818. Here we remained in a state of anxiety and suspense, which may be easier imagined than described. All our attempts to push through were vain, at length being forced, by want of provisions and the approach of a very severe winter, to return to Fury Beach, where alone there remained wherewith to support life. There we arrived on the 7th of October, after a most fatiguing and laborious march, having been obliged to leave our boats at Batty Bay. Our habitation, which consisted of a frame of spars 32 feet by 16, covered with canvas, was during the month of November enclosed, and the roof covered with snow from 4 to 7 feet thick, which, being saturated with water when the temperature was 15 degrees below zero, immediately took the consistency of ice, and thus we actually became the inhabitants of an iceberg during one of the most severe winters hitherto recorded. Our sufferings, aggravated by want of bedding, clothing, and animal food, need not be dwelt upon. Mr. C. Thomas, the carpenter, was the only man who perished at this beach, but 3 others, besides one who had lost his foot, were reduced to the last stage of debility, and only 13 of our number were able to carry provisions in 7 journeys of 62 miles each to Batty Bay. We left Fury Beach on the 8th of July, carrying with us 3 sick men who were unable to walk, and in 6 days we reached the boats where the sick daily recovered. Although the spring was mild, it was not until the 15th of August that we had any cheering prospect. A gale from the westward having suddenly opened a lane of water along shore, in 2 days we reached our former position, and from the mountain we had the satisfaction of seeing clear water across Prince Regent's Inlet, which we crossed on the 17th, and took shelter from a storm 12 miles to the eastward of Cape York. The next day, when the gale abated, we crossed Admiralty Inlet, and were detained 6 days on the coast by a strong northeast wind. On the 25th we crossed Navy Board Inlet, and on the following morning, to our inexpressible joy, we descried a ship in the offing becalmed, which proved to be the Isabella of Hull, the same ship which I commanded in 1818. At noon we reached her, when her enterprising commander, who had in vain searched for us in Prince Regent's Inlet, after giving us 3 cheers, received us with every demonstration of kindness and hospitality which humanity could dictate. I ought to mention also that Mr. Humphreys, by landing me at Possession Bay and subsequently on the west coast of Baffin's Bay, afforded me an excellent opportunity of concluding my survey, and of verifying my former chart of that coast. I have now the pleasing duty of calling the attention of their lordships to the merit of Commander Ross, who was second in the direction of this expedition. The labors of this officer, who had the departments of astronomy, natural history, and surveying, will speak for themselves in language beyond the ability of my pen, but they will be duly appreciated by their lordships and the learned bodies of which he is a member, and who are already well acquainted with his acquirements. My steady and faithful friend, Mr. William Thom, of the Royal Navy, who was formerly with me in the Isabella, besides his duty as third in command, took charge of the meteorological journal, the distribution and economy of provisions, and to his judicious plans and suggestions must be attributed the uncommon degree of health which our crew enjoyed, and as 2 out of 3 who died in the 4 years and a half were cut off early in the voyage by diseases not peculiar to the climate, only 1 man can be said to have perished. Mr. M. Dermod, the surgeon, who had been several voyages to these regions, did justice to the high recommendation I received of him. He was useful in every amputation and operation which he performed, and wonderfully so in his treatment of the sick, and I have no hesitation in adding that he would be an ornament to His Majesty's service. Commander Ross, Mr. Thom, and myself have indeed been serving without pay, but in common with the crew have lost our all, which I regret the more because it puts it out of my power adequately to remunerate my fellow sufferers, whose case I cannot but recommend for their lordships' consideration. We have, however, the consolation that results of this expedition have been conclusive, and to science highly important, and may be briefly comprehended in the following words: the discovery of the Gulf of Boothia, the continent and isthmus of Boothia Felix, and a vast number of islands, rivers, and lakes, the undeniable establishment that the northeast point of America extends to the 74th degree of north latitude, valuable observations of every kind, but particularly on the magnet, and to crown all, have the honor of placing the illustrious name of our most gracious sovereign William IV on the true position of the magnetic pole. I cannot conclude this letter, sir, without acknowledging the important advantages we obtained from the valuable publications of Sir Edward Parry and Sir John Franklin, and the communications kindly made to us by those distinguished officers before our departure from England. But the glory of this enterprise is entirely due to him whose divine favor has been especially manifested towards us, who guided and directed all our steps, who mercifully provided in what we had deemed a calamity his effectual means of our preservation, and who, even after the devices and inventions of man had utterly failed, crowned our humble endeavors with complete success. I have, etc., John Ross, Captain, Royal Navy. To Captain the Honorable George Eliot, etc., Secretary Admiralty. End of chapter 41. Recording by John Brandon.
Chapter 42 of Thrilling Narratives of Mutiny, Murder, and Piracy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Thaler. Thrilling Narratives of Mutiny, Murder, and Piracy by Anonymous. Loss of the Catherine, Venus, and Piedmont transports, and 3 merchant ships. The miseries of war are in themselves great and terrible, but the consequences which arise indirectly from it, though seldom known and little adverted to, are no less deplorable. This destruction of the sword sometimes bears only an inconsiderable proportion to the havoc of disease, and, in the pestilential climates of the western colonies, entire regiments, reared in succession, have as often fallen victims to their baneful influence. To prosecute the war with alacrity, it had been judged expedient to transport a strong body of troops on foreign service, but their departure was delayed by repeated adversities, and at length the catastrophe which is about to be related ensued. On the 15th of November, 1795, the fleet, under convoy of Admiral Kristin's squadron, sailed from St. Helens. A more beautiful sight than it exhibited cannot be conceived, and those who had nothing to lament in leaving their native country enjoyed the spectacle as the most magnificent produced by the art of man, and as that which the natives of this island contemplate with mingled pride and pleasure. Next day, the wind continuing favorable, carried the fleet down channel, and as the Catherine transport came within sight of the Isle of Purbeck, Lieutenant Jenner, an officer on board, pointed out to another person the rocks where the Halswell and so many unfortunate individuals had perished. He and Cornet Burns had been unable to reach Southampton until the Catherine had sailed. Therefore they hired a boy to overtake her, and on embarking at St. Helens, the former expressed his satisfaction in a letter to his mother that he had been so fortunate as to do so. On Tuesday the 17th, the fleet was off Portland, standing to the westward, but the wind shifting and blowing a strong gale at south-southwest, the admiral, dubious whether they could clear the channel, made a signal for putting into Tor Bay, which some of the transports were then in sight of. However, they could not make the bay. The gale increased, and a thick fog came on. Therefore the admiral thought it expedient to alter his design, and about 5 in the afternoon made a signal for standing out to sea. Of the circumstances relative to the Catherine, a more detailed account has been preserved than respecting the other vessels of the fleet, and they are preserved by a female, with whose name we are unacquainted, in these words. The evening of the 17th was boisterous and threatening. The master said he was apprehensive that we should have bad weather, and when I was desired to go on deck and look at the appearance of the sky, I observed that it was troubled and red, with great heavy clouds flying in all directions, and with a sort of dull mist surrounding the moon. On repeating this to the other passengers, 2 of whom had been at sea before, they said we should certainly have a stormy night, and indeed it proved so very tempestuous that no rest was to be obtained. Nobody, however, seemed to think that there was any danger, though the fog was so thick that the master could see nothing by which to direct his course, but he thought that he had sufficient sea room. The fatigue I had suffered from the tossing of the ship, and the violence with which she continued to roll, had kept me in bed. It was about 10 o'clock in the morning of the 18th, when the mate looked down into the cabin and cried, "Save yourselves if you can." The consternation and terror of that moment cannot be described. I had on a loose dressing gown, and wrapping it round me, I went up, not quite on deck, but to the top of the stairs, from whence I saw the sea break mountain high against the shore. The passengers and soldiers seemed thunderstruck by the sense of immediate and inevitable danger. And the seamen, too, conscious of the hopelessness of any exertion, stood in speechless agony, certain of meeting in a few moments that destruction which now menaced them. While I thus surveyed the scene around me in a kind of dread which no words can figure, Mr. Burns, an officer of dragoons, who had come up in his shirt, called to Mr. Jenner and Mr. Staines for his cloak. Nobody, however, could attend to anything in such a moment but self-preservation. Mr. Jenner, Mr. Staines, and Mr. Dodd, the surgeon, now passed me, their countenances sufficiently expressing their sense of the situation in which we all were. Mr. Burns spoke cheerfully to me. He bade me take good courage, and Mr. Jenner observed there was a good shore near, and all would do well. These gentlemen then went to the side of the ship, with the intention, as I believe, of seeing whether it was possible to get on shore. The master of the vessel alone remained near the companion, when suddenly a tremendous wave broke over the ship, and struck me with such violence that I was stunned for a moment, and, before being able to recover myself, the ship struck with a force so great as to throw me from the stairs into the cabin, the master being thrown down near me. At the same instant, the cabin, with a dreadful crash, broke in upon us, and planks and beams threatened to bury us in ruins. The master, however, soon recovered himself. He left me to go again upon deck, and I saw him no more. A sense of my condition lent me strength to disengage myself from the boards and fragments by which I was surrounded, and I once more got upon the stairs, I hardly know how. But what a scene did I behold! The masts were all lying across the shattered remains of the deck, and no living creature appeared on it. All was gone, though I knew not then that they were gone forever. I looked forward to the shore, but there I could see nothing except the dreadful surf that broke against it, while behind the ship immense black waves rose like tremendous ruins. I knew that they must overwhelm her, and thought that there could be no escape for me. Believing then that death was immediate and unavoidable, my idea was to regain my bed in the cabin, and there, resigning myself to the will of God, await the approaching moment. However, I could not reach it, and for a while was insensible. Then the violent striking and breaking up of the wreck again roused me to recollection. I found myself near the cabin windows, and the water was rising round me. It rapidly increased, and the horrors of drowning were present to my view. Yet do I remember seeing the furniture of the cabin floating about. I sat almost enclosed by pieces of the wreck, and the water now reached my breast. The bruises I had received made every exertion extremely difficult, and my loose gown was so entangled among the beams and fragments of the ship that I could not disengage it. Still the desire of life, the hope of being welcomed on shore, whither I thought my friends had escaped, and the remembrance of my child all united in inspiring me with courage to attempt saving myself. I again tried to loosen my gown, but found it impossible, and the wreck continued to strike so violently, and the ruins to close so much more around me, that I now expected to be crushed to death. As the ship drifted higher on the stones, the water rather lessened as the waves went back, but on their return continued to cover me, and I once or twice lost my breath and, for a moment, my recollection. When I had power to think, the principle of self-preservation still urged me to exertion. The cabin now broke more and more, and through a large breach I saw the shore very near. Amidst the tumult of the raging waves, I had a glimpse of the people who were gathering up what the sea drove towards them, but I thought they could not see me, and from them I despaired of assistance. Therefore I determined to make one effort to preserve my life. I disengaged my arms from the dressing gown, and, finding myself able to move, I quitted the wreck and felt myself on the ground. I attempted to run, but was too feeble to save myself from a raging wave which overtook and overwhelmed me. Then I believed myself gone, yet, half suffocated as I was, I struggled very much, and I remember that I thought I was very long dying. The wave left me. I breathed again, and made another attempt to get higher upon the bank, but, quite exhausted, I fell down, and my senses forsook me. By this time I was observed by some of the people on the bank, and 2 men came to my assistance. They lifted me up. I once more recovered some faint recollection, and as they bore me along, I was sensible that one of them said the sea would overtake us, that he must let me go and take care of his own life. I only remember clinging to the other and imploring him not to abandon me to the merciless waves. But I have a very confused idea of what passed, till I saw the boat into which I was to be put to cross the fleet water. I had then just strength to say, "For God's sake, do not take me to sea again." I believe the apprehension of it, added to my other sufferings, tended to deprive me of all further sensibility, for I have not the least recollection of anything afterwards, until roused by the remedies applied to restore me in a farmhouse whither I was carried. There I heard a number of women around me, who asked a great number of questions which I was unable to answer. I remember hearing one say I was a Frenchwoman, another say that I was a Negro, and indeed I was so bruised and in such a disfigured condition that the conjectures of these people are not surprising. When recovering some degree of confused recollection and able to speak, I begged that they would allow me to go to bed. This, however, I did not ask with any expectation of life, for I was now in such a state of suffering that my only wish was to be allowed to lie down and die in peace. Nothing could exceed the humanity of Mr. Abbot, the inhabitant of Fleet farmhouse, nor the compassionate attention of his sister, Miss Abbot, who not only afforded me immediate assistance, but continued for some days to attend me with such kindness and humanity as I shall always remember with the sincerest gratitude. The unfortunate sufferer who gives the preceding account was tended with great humanity by Mr. Briar, while a wound in her foot, and the dangerous bruises she had received, prevented her from quitting the shelter she first found under the roof of Mr. Abbot at Fleet. As soon as she was in a condition to be removed to Weymouth, Mr. Briar, a surgeon there, received her into his own house, where Mrs. Briar assisted in administering to her recovery such benevolent offices of consolation as her deplorable situation admitted. Meantime, the gentlemen of the South Battalion of the Gloucester Militia, who had done everything possible toward the preservation of those who were victims of the tempest, now liberally contributed to alleviate the pecuniary distresses of the survivors. None seemed to have so forcible a claim on their pity as this forlorn and helpless stranger, and she alone of 40 souls, except a single ship-boy, survived the wreck of the Catherine. There perished 12 seamen, 2 soldiers' wives, 22 dragoons, and 4 officers, Lieutenant Staines, Mr. Dodd of the hospital staff, Lieutenant Jenner, the representative of an ancient and respectable family in Gloucestershire, aged 31, and Cornet Burns, the son of an American loyalist of considerable property, who was deprived of everything for his adherence to the British government. Having no dependence but on the promises of government to indemnify those who had suffered on that account, he, after years of distress and difficulty, obtained a cornetcy in the 26th Regiment of Dragoons, then going to the West Indies, and was thus lost in his 24th year. This officer had intended embarking in another transport, and had actually sent his horse on board, when, finding the Catherine more commodious, he gave her the preference, while the other put back to Spithead in safety. the mangled remains of Lieutenant Jenner were 2 days afterwards found on the beach and interred with military honours. But the Catherine was not the only vessel which suffered in the tempest. Those who on shore had listened to it raging in the preceding evening could not avoid feeling the most lively alarm for the consequences, and early on the morning of the 18th of November, several pilots and other persons assembled on the promontory called the Lookout at Weymouth. Thence they too evidently discovered the distress and danger of many of the transports. Soon after, a lieutenant of the navy, residing at Weymouth, applied to the major of a militia regiment for a guard to be sent to the Chisel Bank, as a large ship, supposed to be a frigate, was on shore. This was immediately granted, and the major himself marched along with a captain's guard. The violence of the wind was so great that the party could with difficulty reach the place of their destination. There they found a large merchantman, the Aeolus, laden with timber for government, on shore. Lieutenant Mason of the navy and his brother, a midshipman, perished in her, and a number of men who would probably have been saved had they understood the signals from shore. The men of Portland, who crowded down to the scene of desolation, meant to express by throwing small pebbles at them that they should remain on board. To make them hear was impossible, because they foresaw the ship would drive high on the bank. Should that be the case, they might soon leave her without hazard, and accordingly those who continued on board were saved, though many of them were dreadfully bruised. Not far from the same place, the Golden Grove, another merchantman, was stranded, and in her Dr. Stevens and Mr. Burrows of St. Kitts were lost. Lieutenant Colonel Ross, who was also there, escaped on shore. These two vessels had struck against a part of the passage house, almost in the same spot where a French frigate, the Zenobia, had gone to pieces in 1763. But the scene of distress was infinitely greater about 4 miles to the westward, where, as already related, the Catherine was wrecked. Along with her, nearly opposite to the villages of Fleet and Chickerell, the Piedmont and Venus, 2 transports, and soon after the Thomas, a merchantman, shared the same fate. 138 soldiers of the 63rd Regiment, under the command of Captain Barcroft, were on board the Piedmont, also Lieutenant Ashe and Mr. Kelly, surgeon of the same regiment. Of all these, only Sergeant Richardson, 11 privates, and 4 seamen survived the catastrophe. All the rest perished. Captain Barcroft's life had passed in the service. While yet a very young man, he served in America during the war between England and her colonies, and being then taken prisoner was severely treated. On commencement of the war which has so many years desolated Europe, he raised a company in his native country, and served with it on the continent during the campaign of 1794. Under a heavy fire of the enemy, he was one of the last men who retreated with it along a single plank, knee-deep in water, from the siege of Nijmegen. In a few months after the disastrous retreat on the continent in the winter of 1794, he was ordered to the West Indies, and, in the outset of his voyage, perished in the tempest. Of the few who reached the shore from the Piedmont, there was scarce one who was not dreadfully bruised, and some had their limbs broken. An unfortunate veteran of the 63rd, though his leg was shockingly fractured, had sufficient resolution to creep for shelter under a fishing boat, which lay inverted on the further side of the bank. There his groans were unheard, until a young gentleman, Mr. Smith, a passenger in the Thomas, who had himself been wrecked, and was now wandering along the shore, discovered him. In this ship, the Thomas bound to Oporto, the master, Mr. Brown, his son, and all the crew, except the mate, 3 seamen, and Mr. Smith, were lost. The last was on his way to Lisbon, but his preservation was chiefly in consequence of his remaining on board after all the rest had left the ship, or were washed away by the waves. She had then drifted high on the bank, when he leaped out of her and reached the ground. Though weak and encumbered by his wet clothes, he gained the opposite side of the bank, but on gazing on the dreary beach around him, he considered himself cast away on an uninhabited coast. At length he observed a fishing boat, and approaching it, heard the groans of the unfortunate old soldier, whom he attempted to relieve. But alone he found himself unable to fulfil his intention, and it was a considerable time before he observed any means of assistance near. At last, perceiving a man at some distance, he hastened to him, eagerly inquiring whether a surgeon could be procured for a poor creature with a broken limb, who lay under the boat. Probably the man showed little alacrity, for Mr. Smith found it necessary to purchase his good offices by a gift of half a guinea, which he imagined would induce him to seek what was so much required. But the man, pocketing the half-guinea with the greatest composure, said he was a king's officer, and must see what bales of goods were driven on shore. Then, telling Mr. Smith there was a ferry about 4 miles off, by which he might get to Weymouth. The youth was thus disappointed of his humane design, and the soldier died in that deplorable condition before any other aid attained him. In the Thomas, the vessel to which Mr. Smith belonged, he witnessed scenes not less distressing. Mr. Brown, the master of the vessel, was carried away by an immense wave just as he was stripping off his clothes to endeavour to save himself. His son, exclaiming, "Oh, my father, my poor father," instantly followed. The bodies of both were afterwards found and interred at Wyke. Of 96 persons on board the Venus, only Mr. John Darley of the hospital staff, Sergeant Major Hearn, 12 soldiers, 4 seamen, and a boy were saved. Mr. Darley escaped by throwing himself from the wreck at a moment when it drifted high on the stones. He reached them without broken limbs, but, overtaken by the furious sea, he was carried back, not so far, however, that he was incapable of gaining the ground. Notwithstanding the weight of his clothes and his exhausted state, he got to the top of the bank, but there the power of farther exertion failed, and he fell. While lying in this situation, trying to recover breath and strength, a great many people from the neighbouring villages passed him. They had crossed the Fleet water, in the hopes of sharing the plunder of the vessels, which the lower inhabitants of the coast are too much accustomed to consider their right. Mr. Darley seems to have been so far from meeting with assistance from those who were plundering the dead, without thinking of the living, that although he saw many boats passing and repassing the Fleet water, he found great difficulty in procuring a passage for himself and 2 or 3 fellow sufferers who had now joined him. But having passed it, he soon met with Mr. Brier, to whose active humanity all the sufferers were eminently indebted. Before the full extent of this dreadful calamity was known at Weymouth, the officers of the South Gloucester militia, with equal humanity, were devising how they might best succour the survivors, and perform the last duties to the remains of those who had perished. On the morning of the 19th of November, one of them, accompanied by Mr. Brier of Weymouth, rode to the villages where those who had escaped from the various wrecks had found a temporary shelter. In a house at Chickerell, they found Sergeant Richardson and 11 privates of the 63rd Regiment. 2 of the latter had fractured limbs, and almost all the rest either wounds or bruises. In other houses the sufferers had been received, and were as comfortably accommodated as circumstances would admit. The gentlemen then crossed the Fleet water to the beach, and there, whatever idea was previously formed of it, the horror of the scene infinitely surpassed expectation. No celebrated field of carnage ever presented, in proportion to its size, a more awful sight than the Chisel Bank now exhibited. For about 2 miles it was strewed with the dead bodies of men and animals, with pieces of wreck and piles of plundered goods, which groups of people were carrying away, regardless of the sight of drowned bodies that filled the new spectators with sorrow and amazement. On the mangled remains of the unfortunate victims, death appeared in all its hideous forms. Either the sea or the people who had first gone down to the shore had stripped the bodies of the clothes which the sufferers had worn at the fatal moment. The remnants of the military stock, the wristbands or colour of a shirt, or a piece of blue pantaloons, were all the fragments left behind. The only means of distinguishing the officers was the different appearance of their hands from those of men accustomed to hard labour, but some were known by the description given of them by their friends, or by persons who were in the vessels along with them. The remains of Captain Barcroft were recognized by the honourable scars he had received in the service of his country, and the friends and relatives of him, and several more, had the satisfaction of learning that their bodies were rescued from the sea and interred with military honours. Early in the morning of the 20th of November, a lieutenant of the militia regiment, who had been appointed to superintend the melancholy office of interment, repaired to the scene of destruction, but from the necessary preliminaries of obtaining the authority of a magistrate to remove the bodies, not more than 25 were buried that day. The bodies of Captain Barcroft, Lieutenant Sutherland, Cornet Graydon, Lieutenant Kerr, and 2 women were then selected to be put into coffins. Next day, those of Lieutenant Jenner and Cornet Burns, being found, were distinguished in the like manner. The whole number of dead found on the beach amounted to 234, so that the duty of interment was so heavy and fatiguing that it was not until the 23rd that all the soldiers and sailors were deposited. Of these, there were 208, and they were committed to the earth as decently as circumstances would admit, in graves dug on the Fleet side of the beach, beyond the reach of the sea, where a pile of stones was raised on each to mark where they lay. 12 coffins were sent to receive the bodies of the women, but 9 only being found, the supernumerary ones were appointed to receive the remains of the officers. 2 wagons were next sent to the Fleetwater to receive the coffins, in which the shrouded bodies of 17 officers and 9 women had been placed, and on the 24th were carried to the churchyard at Wyke, preceded by a captain, subaltern, and 50 men of the Gloucester militia, and attended by the young gentleman before mentioned, Mr. Smith, as chief mourner. The officers were interred in a large grave north of the church tower, with military honours, and Lieutenant Kerr in a grave on the other side of the tower. The remains of the 9 women, which had been deposited in the church during the ceremony, were next committed to the earth. 2 monuments have been erected in commemoration of the unfortunate sufferers, the first bearing the following inscription: To the memory of Captain Ambrose William Barcroft, Lieutenant Harry Ashe, and Mr. Kelly, surgeon of the 63rd Regiment of Light Infantry, of Lieutenant Stephen Jenner of the 6th West India Regiment, Lieutenant Staines of the 2nd West India Regiment, and 215 soldiers and seamen and 9 women, who perished by shipwreck on Portland Beach, opposite the villages of Langton, Fleet, and Chickerell, on Wednesday the 18th day of November, 1795. On the second monument is inscribed, Sacred to the memory of Major John Charles Kerr, military commandant of hospitals in the Leeward Islands, and to that of his son, Lieutenant James Kerr of the 40th Regiment of Foot, who both departed this life on the 18th of November, 1795, the first aged 40 and the latter 14 years. The fate of both was truly deplorable, and is a melancholy example of the uncertainty of human affairs. They were embarked in the Venus transport and left Portsmouth on the 15th of November, with a fleet full of troops, destined to the West Indies, under the command of General Sir Ralph Abercrombe. A storm having arisen on the 17th, which lasted till the next day, many of the ships were lost, and the Venus wrecked on Portland Beach. The Major's body could not be found, although it is possible it may have been among the many others who were driven ashore and buried in this churchyard. His son's corpse was ascertained, and lies interred under this stone, which was raised by his brother, John William Kerr, Esquire. End of chapter 42. Recording by Mary Thaler.
Chapter 43 of Thrilling Narratives of Mutiny, Murder, and Piracy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Maxwell. Thrilling Narratives of Mutiny, Murder, and Piracy by Anonymous. Chapter 43. Wreck of the British ship Sydney on a reef of rocks in the South Sea. The Sydney left Port Jackson, on the coast of New Holland, on the 12th of April, 1806, bound to Bengal. Intending to proceed through Dampier Straits, her course was directed as nearly as possible in the track of Captain Hogan of the Cornwallis, which, as laid down in the charts, appeared a safe and easy passage. But on the 20th of May, at 1 a.m., we ran upon a most dangerous rock, or shoal, in 320 south latitude, and 146.50 east longitude, and as this reef is not noticed in any map or chart, it appears that we were its unfortunate discoverers. On Sunday 25 fathoms of water were found over the taffrail, and 6 fathoms over the larboard gangway, only 9 feet on the starboard side, and 12 feet over the bows. One of the boats was immediately got out, with the bower anchor, but on sounding, at the distance of 10 fathoms from the ship, no ground could be found with 60 fathoms of line. When she struck it must have been high water, for at that time there was no appearance of any reef or breaker, but as the water subsided the shoal began to show itself, with a number of small black rocks. The ship had been striking very hard, and began to yield forward. At 3 a.m. there were 6 feet water in the hold, and increasing rapidly. At 5 the vessel was setting aft, and her topsides parting from the floorheads. Upon consultation with my officers, it was our unanimous opinion that the ship was gone beyond recovery, and that no exertions could avail for her safety. We therefore employed all hands in getting the boats ready to receive the crew, who were 108 in number. 8 bags of rice, 6 casks of water, and a small quantity of salted beef and pork were put into the longboat as provisions for the whole. The number of the people prevented us from taking a larger stock, as the 3 boats were barely sufficient to receive us all with safety. We remained with the Sydney until 5 p.m. on the 21st of May, when there were 3 feet of water on the orlop deck. Therefore we now thought it full time to leave the ship to her fate, and to seek our safety in the boats. Accordingly, I embarked in the longboat with Mr. Trounce, second officer, and 74 lascars. Mr. Robson and Mr. Halkart, with 16 lascars, were in the cutter, and the jolly boat was allotted to 15 Dutch Malays and 1 sepoy. Being desirous to ascertain the position of the reef, which could be done by making Admiralty Islands, our course was shaped thither, steering north by east and half east. During the night it blew fresh, and the longboat having made much water, we were obliged to lighten her, by throwing a great deal of lumber and 2 casks of water overboard. The 3 boats kept close in company, the longboat having the jolly boat in tow. Finding at daylight that the cutter sailed considerably better, I directed Mr. Robson that the jolly boat might be taken in tow by her; but the wind increasing as the morning advanced, and a heavy swell rising, the jolly boat, while in tow by the cutter, sunk at 10 o'clock, and all on board, to the number of 16, perished. It was lamentable to witness the fate of these unhappy men, and the more so as it was not in our power to render them the smallest assistance. The Admiralty Islands were seen at noon of the 22nd, bearing north-northeast, 3 or 4 leagues distant, and as we had run about 58 miles in the boats, upon a north by east by half east course, the situation of the shoal where the Sydney struck was accurately ascertained, and will be found as above laid down. From the Admiralty Islands we continued standing to the westward, and on the 25th made a small island, on which, from its appearance, I was induced to land in quest of a supply of water. Therefore Mr. Robson, myself, and 20 of our best hands, armed with heavy clubs, brought from New Caledonia, our firearms being rendered useless from exposure to the rain, landed through a high surf, to the utmost astonishment of the inhabitants. As far as might be judged, they had never before seen people of our complexion. The men were tall and well made, wearing their hair plaited and raised above the head. They had no resemblance to Malays or Caffres, and excepting their color, which was of a light copper, they had the form and features of Europeans. They were entirely naked. We also saw a number of women, who were well formed, and had mild and pleasing features. We were received on the beach by about 20 natives, who immediately supplied each of us with a cocoa nut. We succeeded in making them understand that we wanted water, on which they made signs for us to accompany them to the interior of the island. On compliance, after walking about a mile, they conducted us into a thick jungle, and, as their number was quickly increasing, I judged it imprudent to proceed further. Thus returning to the beach, I was alarmed to find that 150 or more of the natives had assembled, armed with spears 8 or 10 feet long. One of them, an old man of venerable appearance, and who seemed to be their chief, approached and threw his spear at my feet, expressing, as I understood, of his wish that we should part with our clubs in like manner. Perceiving at this time that a crowd of women had got hold of the stern fast of the cutter, and were endeavoring to haul her on shore from the grapnel, we hastily tried to gain the boat. The natives followed us closely. Some of them pointed their spears at us as we retreated, and some were thrown, though happily without effect, and to us they seemed to be very inexpert in the management of their weapons. On my getting into the water, 3 or 4 of the natives followed me, threatening to throw their spears, and when I was within reach of the boat, one of them made a thrust which was prevented from taking effect by Mr. Robson, who warded off the weapon. When we had got into the boat, and were putting off, they threw, at least, 200 spears, none of which struck excepting one, which gave a severe wound to my cook, entering immediately above the jaw, and passing through his mouth. Having escaped this perilous adventure, we pursued our course, and got as far as Dampier's Straits, in as favorable circumstances as our situation could well admit. But the Lascars, now being within reach of land, became impatient to put on shore. It was in vain that I exhorted them to persevere. They would not listen to argument, and expressed their wish rather to meet with immediate death on shore than to be starved to death in the boats. Yielding to their importunity, I at length determined to land them on the northwest extremity of the island of Ceram, from whence they might travel to Abonia in 2 or 3 days. Being off that part of the island on the 9th of June, Mr. Robson volunteered to land a portion of the people in the cutter, to return to the longboat, and the cutter to then be given up to such further portion of the crew as chose to join the party first landed. Accordingly, he went ashore with the cutter, but to my great mortification, after waiting 2 days, there was no appearance of his return or of the cutter. We concluded that the people had been detained either by the Dutch or the natives. Yet as the remaining part of the Lascars were desirous to be landed, we stood in with the longboat, and put them on shore near the point where we supposed the cutter to have landed her people. Our number in the longboat were now reduced to 17, consisting of Mr. Trounce, Mr. Halkart, myself, and 14 Lascars and others. Our stock of provision was 2 bags of rice and 1 gang cask of water, with which we conceived we might hold out until reaching Bencoolen, whither we determined to make the best of our way. The allowance to each man we fixed at 1 teacupful of rice and a pint of water daily, but we soon found it necessary to make a considerable reduction. Proceeding through the Straits of Bantam, we met in our course several Malay praus, none of which took notice of us excepting one, which gave chase for a day, and would have come up with us had we not got off under cover of a very dark night. Continuing onwards, we passed through the Strait of Sapé, where we caught a large shark. Our spirits were much elated by this valuable prize, which we lost no time in getting on board, and having kindled a fire in the bottom of the boat, it was roasted with all expedition. Such was the keenness of our appetite, that although the shark must have weighed 150 or 160 pounds, not a vestige of it remained at the close of the day. But we were afflicted on the following day with the most violent complaint of the stomach and bowels, which reduced us exceedingly, and left us languid and spiritless, insomuch that we now despaired of safety. On the 2nd of July, I lost an old and faithful servant, who died from want of sustenance, and on the 4th we made Java Head, at the same time catching 2 large boobies, which afforded all hands a most precious and refreshing meal. On the midnight of the 9th we came to off Pulo Penang, on the west coast of Sumatra, but at daylight, when endeavoring to weigh our anchor and run close in shore, we were so much exhausted that our united strength proved insufficient to get it up. On a signal of distress being made, a sampan with 2 Malays came off, and as I was the only person in the long boat who had sufficient strength to move, I accompanied them on shore. However, I found myself so weak on landing that I fell to the ground, and it was necessary to carry me to an adjacent house. Such refreshments as could be procured were immediately sent off to the longboat, and we recruited so rapidly that in 2 days we found ourselves in a condition to proceed on our voyage. Having weighed anchor on the 12th of July, we set sail, and on the 19th arrived off the island of Bencoolen. Here I met with an old friend, Captain Chavette of the Perseverance, whose kindness and humanity I shall ever remember and gratefully acknowledge. On the day subsequent to my arrival, I waited on Mr. Parr, the resident, from whom I received every attention. Leaving Bencoolen on the 17th of August, in the Perseverance, I arrived at Penang on the 27th, where I was agreeably surprised to meet my late chief mate, Mr. Robson, who along with the Lascars had landed at Ceram. They reached Amboyna in safety, where they were received by the Dutch governor, Mr. Cranstoun, with a humanity and benevolence that reflect honor on his character. He supplied them with whatever their wants required. Mr. Robson was accommodated at his own table, and on leaving Amboyna, he furnished him money for himself and his people, for the amount of which he refused to take any receipt or acknowledgment. He also gave Mr. Robson letters to the Governor General of Batavia, recommending him to his kind offices. Such honorable conduct from the governor of a foreign country, and with which we were at war, cannot be too widely promulgated. From Amboyna, Mr. Robson embarked in the Pallas, a Dutch frigate, for Batavia, which on the passage thither was captured by his Majesty's ships Greyhound and Harriet, and brought to Prince of Wales Island. From Penang I sailed to Bengal with the Paruna, Captain Dennison, and arrived safely in Calcutta in the beginning of May, 1806. End of chapter 43.